And it says this, verse 12, Isaac planted crops in that land, in Philistia. And the same year he reaped 100-fold because the Lord blessed him. And the man became rich, and his wealth continued to grow until he became very wealthy. So he's carrying on the lineage of prosperity of his father. He had so many flocks and herds and servants, all the status symbols of the ancient world, that the Philistines envied him. You would too, by the way. Here you are in Philistia, and your crops have dried up. There's a famine. And here you have Isaac, who is a foreigner, and he's buying his 7th Porsche. That's sort of the picture that you get. He had so many flocks and herds, and his servants and the Philistines envied him. So all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the time of his father Abraham, the Philistines stopped up, filling them with earth or with dirt. Now, we'll see this in just a second. Abraham had lived in this exact same place some 75 years earlier, and he had dug wells to provide nourishment to his flocks, to his herds, to his servants. This is what you did in the ancient world. It says, then Abimelech said to Isaac, move away from us. You have become too powerful for us. So Abimelech, the king of Philistia, sees this guy who does not look like him, does not speak his language, and says, you have to get out of here. You have become too powerful. Now, if you go back 75 years, Abraham and Abimelech Sr., now you have Isaac and Abimelech Jr., but 75 years earlier, this well that they've thrown dirt in was the well of Abraham, and there was some kind of peace treaty that was made at this well. Genesis 21, I'll just read this very, very quickly. It says, then Abraham, Isaac's father, complained to Abimelech, which was, most historians believe, is Abimelech Jr.'s father. He was the king at that time. Complained to him about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. But Abimelech said, I don't know who has done this. You did not tell me about it, and I heard about it only today. So Abraham, verse 27, brought sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech. And the two men made a treaty. So 75 years earlier, this comes into play in a moment, 75 years earlier, this very well had been a place of peace and treaty and a covenant established between their fathers. 75 years later, Isaac and Abimelech, this very well has become a place of controversy. And the reason is it's just good old-fashioned jealousy. Jealousy is that thing in our heart where often the conflict begins. It's where someone's hatred or anger or frustration began with you. And jealousy it hides in our heart. It's not one of those sins that anybody ever admits. It's kind of like greed. Nobody ever would say, my big struggle is greed. You know somebody who's greedy, but you would never say about yourself that you're greedy. Jealousy is the same way. You would never say, I'm really just jealous. Jealousy, in fact, it hides in our feelings of moral superiority. Moral superiority is often, it's jealousy dressed up. And essentially, what happens here, I hope everything's okay back there. I really do. And I hope it's not one of my children. Abimelech, essentially what happens here, sorry. I hope I didn't make her feel bad. Oh man, okay, where are we? Gosh. I'm so used to this at my house, anyway. So in this particular story, what's happening is he's throwing mud into the well of Abraham, and he's doing it because he's jealous. Now, jealousy is essentially, it dresses itself up in our life in terms of moral superiority. There we go. Moral superiority. And thank you for that. I'm doing my best. Essentially, how does that work? Let me explain it this way. Several years ago, I was living in Dallas, Texas, and some friends of mine from my church, we went to another friend's house that we knew, but we didn't know him very well. And we pulled up at his house, and he had this palatial estate, and none of us knew this was his house, his land. And we were sitting in the car, and this other gentleman from our church, he made a comment, something along the lines of, well, if he was really a good Christian, he would sell this place and he would give the money to the poor. Well, didn't you pick an interesting time to get charitable, Frank? Was that statement made from a spirit of charity? Or was that statement, was it made from a spirit of jealousy? Of course. It was a spirit of jealousy. What I know about everyone who was in that car, and the conversation sort of turned in that direction. Yeah, man, this seems like everyone in that car, all, just like everybody in this room, all in the top 1% of the world's wealth. Nobody up until that moment had any discussions about selling any of their possessions and giving anything to the poor. But all of a sudden, jealousy dressed up as moral superiority. This is what begins to happen. Now, in this case, what do? He begins to follow Isaac around, and he's throwing dirt literally into the signs of prosperity that he has. Let me ask you a question. Who is it that's shoveling dirt into your wells today? Who is it that is following you around? Who is it in your life, at work, in your family? They're literally mudslinging in your direction. Their anger, their agitation, just like Abimelech, it's not at you. It's that God has given you something that God has not given them. And what may be a moral superiority, well, I'm better than him, I'm better than her, is actually deep. It's just good old-fashioned jealousy. Who is it that is reaching for the shovel when you walk in the room and they're slinging mud in your direction? On the other side of it, who is it when you hear their name, when they come up in conversation at dinner, you can see the conflict coming, and you are tempted to shovel dirt in their direction. Now, you never think of it that way. You think of it as moral superiority. It comes in 1,000 different ways. I'll give you another example. It's that moment where maybe they pull up in their car. Maybe it's that moment where you go to their house. Maybe it's that moment when you see they're talking about a vacation or something, and you and your spouse get in the car, and you're driving home from their house, and you're like, well, that certainly was a nice house. I didn't know I even saw a Mont Blanc pen on the counter. Where do they get that kind of money? Did they say they're going on vacation to Tahiti? What did he say he's in sales? What does he sell? He sells drugs. I bet he sells drugs. Well, we may not be as prosperous as them, but at least we're not drug dealers. I'm so proud of you, honey. Earning your honest living. And all of a sudden, moral superiority. It's just jealousy dressed up. And who is it? When they walk in the room, you find yourself ready to throw some dirt in their direction. Who is it that, maybe they're throwing dirt in your direction right now, and it has nothing to do with you, which Isaac understands. We'll see this in a second. And he's able to shake the dust off and move on. But who is it that the conflict begins in jealousy?